Hello and welcome to another episode of Buyer Backlog. We are more or less just catching up on our games for this month, and this one is Chronos New Dawn, a game that, well, in short, will probably end up being one of my favorite games of this year, if not one of my favorite survival horror games of all time. As always, this review system is based on a simple buy or backlog idea, meant as a way to keep things simple because, let's be honest, the point system always messes things up. But without further ado, let's get right into it with the actual review of this game. Welcome to Chronos The New Dawn, a game that, more than anything, feels like a very beautiful mix of Dead Space and the Silent Hill 2 remake, and even a little bit of the Resident Evil 4, all bundled into a survival horror kind of almost smorgasbord that feels amazing to play. So right off the bat, Chronos New Dawn's story can be summed up pretty simply as you play as the Traveler, someone who works for the shady organization known as the Collective, whose sole mission is to more or less save humanity from these goopy, alien, monstrous looking thingies, I guess you could call them, who were once humans not that long ago, which kind of turns into more or less you doing time travel and like you're seeking people to kind of absorb their memories. It has a very unique premise, and I think to simplify it without dumbing it down would be you play as this person who's going back in time to more or less try to prevent this virus, which is the virus that turns everybody into, they're called orphans, but they're just goopy, nasty looking kind of humans that are kind of brought together in the way, kind of the same way as like the Thing. Like they turn into these monsters with like extra limbs and extra talons and so on and so forth. But you're playing as this traveler, more or less jumping between different time. I think it's set between 1981 and then an unset time period where you're jumping between these two in an attempt to kind of figure out what happened by more or less absorbing people's memories, the humans that are left in the past, and kind of figuring out what happens. Now, the story really does take an interesting couple turns, and though I do think it does falter a bit in the beginning, I do think it serves quite appropriately for what would amount to a kind of Dead Space esque idea that you're trying to kind of find out what happened, like what caused all these humans to turn into these kind of gross looking, disgusting monsters that have no other purpose in this game besides trying to murder you. And believe me, from a gameplay perspective, which we'll talk about in a little bit, it does a very good job. Now, Chronos The New Dawn is a game that, from a story and kind of a world perspective, everything looks amazing. I will say that Blue Bear, as with the Silent Hill 2 remake, did an amazing job here. And honestly, I think going forward, they're probably going to be known as one of the more horror staples in the gaming industry as a whole. Because not only have they proved that they can do a remake really well, because the Silent Hill 2 remake was one of the best games released last year, but Chronos The New Dawn feels like something that's new while also feeling like something that kind of takes inspiration from those that came before. Now, if you're wondering from the story what I mean by you're playing as this traveler who absorbs people's memories, this clip right here is actually the first one you kind of take, and it kind of puts emphasis on the idea that, like, we're trying to figure out what caused this virus to kind of evolve and turn into this giant mess. And every time you the story pushes you towards different people in the past that know things about the outbreak. And every time you kind of get one of them and you figure out what's going on, the story kind of pushes you forward towards either figuring out what's going on or letting everything kind of unravel in front of you. And honestly, the story is simple enough and it hits hard enough to where, though the gameplay might feel like the central aspect, but because from a survival horror aspect, it's very good, the story does more than enough to push you forward. And I think more than anyone that likes survival horror as a whole, anybody who is a fan of Dead Space or the Resident Evil 4 remake or even Silent Hill, it has aspects of all that in its story and its world. And I really do think what you have here, from a story perspective at least, is a pretty solid, we could say 8-ish out of 10. I know we said the number system is stupid, but the story isn't what's really going to keep you here. The thing that's going to keep you here in this game is the gameplay. Now, from a gameplay perspective, Chronos The New Dawn is, in every sense of the word, survival horror. You are going to be fighting for your life every second, and you are going to almost always be on the defensive when it comes to most of these fights with these orphans, which is what the name of the enemy is called. I don't know how they came up with that name. I ain't going to ask any questions just for the simple purpose of why not. But every fight with the orphans is more or less just a stringent kind of just cluster of body parts and blood and gore, and like you're always going to be running for your life. And the game does a really good job from its survival horror aspects in kind of feeding into the idea that this is a horror game. It doesn't really rely on the cheap jump scares that you'd expect. I mean, Dead Space had a lot of jump scares and was still really efficient. But this game does its kind of scariness just with its environment in like the best way possible. Confined corridors and kind of endless darkness that surrounds you on every side are really is what is going to drive you forward, and you can always expect for there to be something around the next corner that is going to want to kill you. And I think that's really what makes this game such a good survival horror game. The whole sense of that you have all these weapons at your disposal and you have a limited inventory system and you have little upgrades you can get. It very much feels like Dead Space in that regard. But I also think that it does the basic aspects of survival horror so well that I really can't hate it for what it does in any sense of the word. I was stressed the whole time. But if you're into survival horror like me, this game is more or less going to tinker and kind of cater to what you think survival horror is. It is survival horror done to damn near perfection, and I was thoroughly impressed most of the time for what it amounts to. Of course, like I said in the story, the whole purpose is you are trying to find these different time loops, more or less, and kind of discover what happened in the past. And that has you shooting your way through hospitals and underground little crypts and churches. And the variety that you see here and kind of the gameplay itself kind of revolves just into these like darkened corridors that are always infested with these giant like hive, almost Last of Us looking like spore clusters, but with, human body parts instead. So they do a very good job on that aspect of just being. It's really just scary because the darkness seems to envelop you and kind of consume you from every side. And I think Bluer did a really good job as far as that goes. Just the general ambience of the game and how your character functions. Like it feels like Dead Space meets Resident Evil from a gameplay perspective. Like you have mobility, but you're more or less locked in place when you are firing your shots. But on the same note, your character is mobile enough to where you can actually get away from things, reposition, and kind of re-engage as you see fit. I really do think the gameplay is the best aspect of this game. You have access to about 8 different weapons, which each weapon having 4 main weapons, with each weapon having its own kind of secondary mode, so to say. So I mean, it very much feels like a not a copy of Dead Space, because copy would be discounting what Bluebird has done here. I think they just kind of took inspiration from the original Dead Space formula, being Dead Space 1 and 2, and I would say damn near perfected it. From a survival horror aspects or survival horror kind of perspective, this game is amazing. And I think anybody that is a survival horror fan at all, if you're a fan of like the newer RE4, RE2, RE3s, Silent Hill 2 remake, any kind of thing like that, even the Dead Space remake, I think if you're a fan of any game like that, you're going to feel right at home here. Because nearly every system in place feels really well made, and you're more or less going to always be jumping from place to place, cutting your way through the orphans as you see fit. Which, what a messed up phrase that is, cutting your way through orphans. But the game also has a couple different other things besides just gunplay and kind of survival horror. There's like this gravity boot system where you can kind of navigate like almost akin to, I don't know the best way to describe it. The thing that comes to mind is like Ratchet and Clank. Like you can jump from different, kind of like you can be on the ground floor, you can be on the roof, you can be on the walls, and you can kind of navigate to different places as you see fit. There's this little electrical system where you can more or less, you're connecting generators and stuff like that. Like it has a ton of features from a gameplay perspective that I almost feel like kind of just letting people explore and discover. But I will say that this game has nearly perfected the survival horror aspects. It's so great to play. Everything is a terrifying slog through these like darkened corridors, and kind of just the way that the game plays and feels. It really is one of the best survival horror games that I have played in recent memory. Granted, I would say it's up there with Silent Hill 2 remake. I would say it's up there with the Rari 4 remake. And honestly, I can see this game being just a sleeper hit of 2025. I know this year's got a ton of things released. Silksong just came out. We have more games coming out in the next month that I care to mention. But I do hope that this game doesn't get snubbed at the awards ceremony, as it really is something that feels unique. And I think Bloober did a really amazing job with it. So to wrap things up, the story does leave you kind of wanting more. The whole premise is that you are more or less hunting down people in the past and kind of figuring out what happened with the plague. But towards the middle, when we're kind of like just figuring out what's going on, that can get kind of dry and repetitive. So I think a lot of people, including myself, would say that the middle of the story is a little weaker, but it does pick up towards the later half. So probably like the last third is really interesting. The first third is really interesting, but right in the middle is kind of eh. But I mean, it does deal with a really interesting idea that you are these time traveling kind of almost like the best way to put them would be time traveling, not mechs, but kind of like almost drones that are just being sent back in time and sent back in time and sent back in time and getting murdered on the way. And your job is to kind of try to pick up the pieces of what actually happened. And by the end, you will find yourself more than satisfied with the ending you get, as it does kind of leaning to the idea that we might not have seen the end of this universe yet. From a gameplay perspective, I mean, there really isn't much to say. It is survival horror, third person survival horror with like inventory management and stuff like that, done to near perfection. They have done it as well as anybody has in the past. And the first thought, besides obviously the comparisons that I made with like the Dead Space and like just the way it kind of feels, is that it feels just like the love child of a couple games that are all amazing on their own. So I don't think anybody from a survival horror aspect is going to be complaining here. And I do see a world where this game will be remembered as a game that not necessarily pioneered anything as far as survival horror, but they have certainly taken their creative liberties with things and improved them in the best ways possible. So, if it's not obvious by now, I love this game. Honestly, I bought it 2 days early with the deluxe edition, and I was super proud. Usually, when I buy the deluxe editions and spend that extra 20 bucks, I feel super disgusted with myself. But this game, I felt pretty okay because honestly, it's a great time, and I think Bloober did a really good job here. My recommendation, of course, will be a buy for any fans of survival horror as well. It really does everything that you want it to, or everything that you'd want in a survival horror in the best way possible. For those of you that aren't fans of survival horror, this might be worth a wait as far as just, kind of maybe waiting till this time period kind of chills out a little bit. But I think that any fans of survival horror will love this game for everything it is and will no doubt be at least somewhat happy with a buy. Of course, that is all I have for today. And as always, I hope you all have a good rest of your day, a good rest of your month, and a good rest of your year. And I will see you on the next video.